Welcome back everyone! Today I'm gonna show you how I made this two-piece summer dress that was inspired by the costumes of the Great. If you haven't seen it already, it's about the life of Catherine the Great, Tsarina of Russia. It's an anachronistic and very fun show. I would highly recommend it to watch, for nothing else than for the amazing and beautiful costumes. I fell in love with the costume so much, I just had to make my own modernized version. My plan was to make a sleeveless summer dress. And the first step was to figure out my bodice pattern. I started by using a thin tape to mark out where I want my seams to be on my dummy, using this Janet Arnold book as a reference to see how a historically accurate pattern should look like. To make the pattern, I laid pieces of fabric on top, and I transferred the tape markings onto the fabric. Then I cut the fabric to shape. To make sure I did everything alright, I made a mock-up. As you can see, the bodice turned out a little bit too short, but that was to be expected as my dummy is very short-waisted. I also left out the middle back seam by mistake, and then I also realized I don't like the pattern as much as I would like it. As I wanted this dress to be very practical and everyday wearable, I intended it to close on the side with a zipper. And that's why I left out the front middle seam that you can see on most of Catherine's costumes. I just didn't want a functionless, ugly seam right down in the front middle. And that's why I made my own pattern, where the shaping was achieved by the two front seams that were supposed to imitate a stomacher. But at the end, I decided that making my own pattern was more trouble than worse, so I went back to the drawing board, and I just used the American Duchess book's 18th century Italian gown bodice pattern to make it. Luckily I have used this pattern before, so I had it at hand, so I didn't have to blow it up and print it out and cut it out and glue it together as the first time I used it. So that saved me some time. But using this pattern, I just laid it on top of my folded fabric and I cut out each pattern piece twice. When cutting out the pattern, I made one alteration though. Taking one of the front panels, I have folded it where I wanted my zipper to be and shortened the bodice with some seam allowance left on. Then using the other half of this folded pattern, I cut a new side piece. Pinning the pieces together, I sewed all the seams up except for where the zipper is gonna go. Trying the bodice on, I marked out where I wanted the new neckline and armholes to be. To be able to fit the bodice perfectly, I needed to put in the zipper first. Then I pressed the seams flat. Then I decided that I'm gonna line the bodice. So I cut out the pattern pieces again from this nice plain cotton. Pinning it, I sewed the lining pieces together as well, the same way I did it with the bodice, leaving the side seam open for the zipper. Then, with my dummy's help, I laid the lining piece on top of my fashioned fabric and sewed around the neckline. Trimming down the seam allowance, I notched it and turned the pieces inside out. Then I overstitched around the neckline, because I knew I would be covering this part with a trim anyway, and it wouldn't be visible in the end result. To try to figure out how to finish the edges of the trim, I made some tests. For the first one, I used a rolled hem foot to finish the edges, but this resulted in a very bulky and unappealing trim that didn't pleat very well. The second one I used the selvage of the actual fabric and I just melted the other edge with a candle. And I like this method a lot more, so this is what I used to make my pleated trim. I had to be very careful when I cut the strip for this trim, because I only had 2 selvages of the fabric. And I wanted to use one of the selvages to be the hem of my skirt. So I had one chance to make it right. To make sure I cut this trim completely straight, I pulled out one thread and I followed the hole this pulled out thread made while cutting. Then I used a little tea light to very carefully melt the edge of this trim. Then I pleated it up just by eye, trying to make sure that the pleats were very even. Then I pressed it and ran it through the sewing machine. And just when I was done with it, I realized that the strip was way too wide for what I wanted to achieve, and the pleats were way too big. I made another little mock-up piece, and I liked that one a lot more. So I cut my original strip down to a thinner width, and I resewed the middle line. I also had to remelt this cutted edge. But it didn't end here. I actually realized I wanted the pleats to be much closer together, so that meant I had to rip out all the sewing I did and repress the strip so it would be flat, and then repleat it again by hand. I cut 2 panels for the skirt, using the same thread pulling technique as before to make sure I cut straight. sewed the pieces together. To figure out how I wanted the skirt to be pleated, I did some tests on my dummy. With that, I determined I'm gonna go for a somewhat historically accurate shape by having pleats on the side and the back and a flat front panel. I used the fork pleating method to make the pleats on my skirt. When I cut to the middle back seam, I changed the direction of my pleats because I wanted them all to face towards the back. Then I secured the pleats in place by sewing across the top edge. Trying the skirt on, I actually really loved how it looked, and I found it a shame that I would not have a skirt just to wear. So I decided I'm gonna make it a two-piece dress. So I'll be able to wear the skirt as a skirt, and then I can put the bodice on top and use it as a dress, which not only makes it more historically accurate, it also allows me to take another of Catherine's costumes as inspiration, because in the show sometimes she also wears just skirts with blouses. To make it a separate skirt though, it meant I needed to make a waistband for it. So I cut out a strip of fabric and I strengthened it with fusible interfacing. I ironed it in half and pinning it to the top edge of the skirt, I sewed it on. To finish the waistband, first I had to hem the side seams of the skirt. Then I folded the inside edge of the waistband in and sewed it down by hand. To finish the hem of the skirt, I used this satin ribbon, sewed it on by machine, and then I folded it back and sewed it on again. I used a mixture of hooks and snaps for closure. To finish the bodice, I cut a couple strips of bias. To finish the armhole, I pinned on the strip of the bias, sewed it on, then folded it back twice and sewed it down by hand carefully, so the stitching will only catch the lining piece and not the fashion fabric, so the stitches won't show from the outside. the bottom edge of the bodice, I used a similar but a little different technique, where I sewed on the strip and then folded it back twice, but in a way so the bias strip would show from the outside too. And then I sewed on the trim. As a last step, I had to sew on some hooks and eyes, so the bodice wouldn't shift when I was wearing it together with the skirt. I sewed the hooks to the interior of the bodice. Then I made the eyes from a thread matching the fabric, so when I wear the skirt alone, you wouldn't be able to tell. And that was that. So I really like how this dress turned out. My only issue with it that it looks a little bit like a bridesmaid's dress. Meaning it's maybe a little too fancy to wear it to work. Maybe if you make it from a plainer fabric like a cotton or something, it could be a bit more common use. I might do that one day actually, because I just really like how this dress turned out. I wore it for a whole day when we were shooting this dress and it was perfectly comfortable. I had no issues with it, even though it was 30 degrees outside. And I love the skirt by itself too. It's so wonderfully swishy. Well, thanks for stopping by.